Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to another edition of the Spurs Chat podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to bring on for the very first time Tom Barclay, senior football writer with The Sun. Tom, thanks so much for coming on this evening. How are you?
I'm good, Chris. My pleasure to be on. I've watched from afar since I've started covering Spurs, your influence and your growth in your channel and how well it's done and how passionate you are for Tottenham and how much you go the extra yards covering them. It's really impressive, and so it's a delight to be here.
Thank you so much, Tom. And talking about YouTube channels, you've just started your own YouTube channel. You're very close to 1,000 subscribers. So hopefully by the time you get off this stream this evening, you would have hit over 1,000. Tell everyone about it.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Yeah, so I think it was back in maybe August. I decided, influenced by my good friend Ali Gold, who's obviously big on YouTube, just as you are as well. He kept sort of suggesting that I should do more social media. I've not really done a whole lot. I've got a Twitter account, but yeah, I don't know. I just kind of thought, particularly with Ali, who does what he does, where he does these kind of long form kind of reflective videos, in the middle of the week. There was maybe a little bit of a lack of people doing instant reaction to press conferences and games who are journalists who are actually there asking the questions. I know obviously you do so many things, including the instant reaction, but I suppose being someone who gets to ask Ange the questions in the press conference, I felt like something that I thought might be of interest to people, and it's been steadily growing, and like you say, not far off now, so fingers crossed. And yeah, people seem to like it. It's interesting though, because I'm kind of very early on in it, so it's kind of baby steps, seeing the difference between the interest in it post a good win versus when it doesn't go so well. It's unsurprisingly, I suppose, it's quite different, but no, it's all good fun.
Tom, you also cover England as well. What's that like?
Yeah, it's good. It keeps me busy, put it that way. I covered the senior team now as of the last about a year, I suppose, or maybe more than that. I can't remember now. But yeah, I mean, I've literally just got back from, I guess we've been at home, haven't we? The game on Sunday was at Wembley, but went to Greece. But obviously the week before that was Istanbul with Tottenham. In between that, I was my best man at my best mate's wedding. So it's been a busy period, put it that way. England's great. It's busy. It's obviously kind of the pinnacle from a journalist point of view. It's interesting times. Lee Carsley's someone I got to know quite well because I covered the under-21 team for 4 years before I moved on to the seniors, including being at that amazing under-21 Euros triumph, I guess last summer or 2023, when he was the manager. So it's been interesting to watch him take this interim period. But personally, seeing as it wasn't going to be him, even though I kind of wanted it to be, having Thomas Tuchel come in is from a journalist point of view is a dream, because it's something that everyone instantly has an opinion about. He's box office. He is a winner. Whether that will pan out that way or not, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you have your own thoughts on it, because I know you do stuff after England as well. But it's a really interesting time. Probably less so from a Tottenham fan point of view, because there just aren't as many players as there have been in years gone by. But obviously Dominic Solanke is pushing Kane and Watkins all the way as well. And the way he's playing so far for Spurs, and if he gets better, you could see him being a part of this the future squad.
Tom, I tell you, I've been to, I think in the last 10 years, 5 cup finals, 3 with Spurs, 2 with England. We've lost the whole lot. Harry Kane has played in all of them. I've been at all of them. I tell you, one of us is cursed. We'll talk about Ange Postecoglou in a minute, but what is it like for you as a journalist with The Sun covering Tottenham Hotspur?
Yes, it's a pleasure. It's an interesting club in the sense that it's not. It doesn't dominate. Tottenham doesn't dominate the back pages like a Man United or a Chelsea, but it's not far off. It's a lot more than when I used to cover. I don't know, your Southamptons, your Brightons, your Crystal Palaces. It's like a step up, a long way from there. The fact that I am, along with England, just on Tottenham pretty much. I mean, if I have a story or an interview opportunity with someone from a different club, I obviously can do that. But Spurs is where I'm at every week, and that sort of underlines just how important how much significance we think Tottenham have in the football hierarchy, and how much and it keeps me busy. It's not like I'm sort of twiddling my thumbs. Like every day there's something to write. You know, sometimes it doesn't. It will vary from day to day. It feels like, you know, for example, with Man United, particularly at the minute, or since ever really, whatever is said makes, you know, back pages, spreads, page leads. Tottenham is probably not quite as much as that, but it's not far off, as I say. And no, I really enjoy it. I think the club are pretty good to deal with, to be honest, compared to some of the other clubs in years gone by. I know people have their own thoughts, which I'm sure we'll come on to in terms of the ownership and all that kind of thing, but they're good to deal with. I really like dealing with Ange Postecoglou in press conferences, pre-match in particular. Post-match, he can be quite grumpy when it's been a bad defeat, but or not gone the way he wants. But to be honest, he's not alone by any stretch compared to other managers. But pre-match it's where you feel like you can ask him anything, literally anything, if you catch him in a good mood, and he will listen to what you have to say and then think of how he wants to answer it. And as a journalist, that's the most you can ask for. I'd say, to finish the point, you know, Antonio Conte, as box office as he was and how great he was for a journalist point of view, it felt like when you went into those press conferences, it didn't really matter what you asked him. He already knew what he wanted to say, and you often just sort of disregard your question anyway and just say what he wanted to say. Whereas I feel with Ange, he will listen to you and give his actual thoughts on what your question is. So that's I enjoy that a lot.
Tom, during your time covering Tottenham, you've obviously spoken to a lot of people, ex-players, current players, the managers. Who has been the most interesting to talk to? Who have you enjoyed conversations with?
I don't know, that's sort of caught me off guard. I mean, it's hard to sort of look away from Ange Postecoglou. I mean, honestly, like for the reasons I just gave, like he obviously came in with this amazing backstory. People didn't really know too much about him, and then they're sort of finding out about him through articles that we, you know, all over the internet and stuff we would write, you know, with this quite a unorthodox route to getting to where he had done. And, you know, as for the reasons I just mentioned, like you could ask him about various different things and he will come up with often come up with an interesting answer. So it's hard to beat him, really. I mean, you slightly caught me off guard when it comes to that kind of thing, but I suppose I'm so used to you know, across my time, you know, nearly sort of 14 years of sort of doing this from all different levels. I used to cover the Football League specifically for the Sun, so a lot of League Two, League One, Championship interviews. Yeah. You know, you meet some interesting people, but a lot of the time it is quite standard kind of football-y answers, not as many human interest stories, and sometimes kind of the kind of answers you're expecting half the time. And half the battle is trying to get people to say more interesting things than what they generally would like to, because it makes for more interesting articles. But with Ange, you don't even really have to try. It just always comes up with something interesting. And often you'll go into a press conference having an idea of what you know, a theme or whatever that you might want to come away from with it. And he'll come up with something that you weren't expecting at all. And that's, again, purely from a journalist point of view, that is gold dust to a certain extent.
Have you ever sat down with someone like Daniel Levy and ever asked him any questions?
I've only had one interaction with him. One like sit down with him, and it wasn't for an interview. It was very early on in my time covering Spurs. So I started covering Tottenham in, I think it was about May 2022, I guess. I don't know how well people will know sort of the history of top coverage at the Sun, but it came through very tragic circumstances. My predecessor, the wonderful Paul Jiggins, late great Paul Jiggins, very tragically passed away. And basically that's how I got them moved on to Tottenham after that. And that's how I sort of picked them up from there. So, you know, just very sad situation, but I guess somebody had to do the job, and I was the one who's given it. And quite quickly after that followed, so that was towards the end of that season, right? So then we went on tour to South Korea that summer with Antonio Conte. You know, quite a lot sticks out, you know, Jed Spence being labelled a club signing and all that kind of thing was you know, and Seoul as well. I think you might have been there at the time.
I was there. Incredible.
I've been to a lot of countries now with various, you know, clubs and England, and Seoul's often the one that I pick out when people ask me like favorite place to go. I just loved it for a lot of reasons, particularly the food, but just really cool. And there was one afternoon where we went. There's 4 of us there, 4 journalists, who went to Tottenham's hotel, and we had basically coffee with Daniel Levy. And like I say, I obviously knew a lot about him. You know, you can't not work in football without knowing him, but I don't think I had the sort of Spurs every day like I do now kind of thoughts back then, I suppose. Like, but it wasn't exactly like we were grilling him with questions. It was more just an introduction. And to be honest, it hasn't actually really happened since. I don't know how well it went on reflection, but that was the only time really. He, I wouldn't say he said that much, but he was perfectly pleasant as well. It was only for about 10 minutes, and that was it. And I can see how a lot of fans would want him to have more interactions with journalists, to be able to, because remember, journalists are only conduits for the fans to be able to ask, you know, the people who they care about in terms of the club questions on behalf of them. It would be nice to be able to do more of that. You know, obviously there was the fans forum for the last couple of years, which hasn't been a regular thing as so far as I'm aware. I think the one last year was the first time in 5 years, but journalists weren't allowed to either of those either. So yeah, it's a bit of a shame that we don't get more of a chance to speak to him, but maybe in the future that might change.
Tom, obviously you don't support Spurs. Is it easier for you to cover Tottenham when you don't support them?
Yeah, I think so. To a certain extent. Well, yes and no. So I think, so I'm a big football fan. Obviously, if I wasn't, I don't know why I'd be doing this job. And you know, I've got a bit of a encyclopedic Premier League in particular knowledge just from growing up and being absolutely obsessed with football. So I'm South London, so I've got a lot of mates who are Spurs fans, season ticket holders as well. So I've grown up with them and the passion they've had for the teams in the 90s and the 2000s and all that kind of thing. So I've got a lot of knowledge of them. But when I speak to I know other mates of mine who work in it, like Dan Kilpatrick or Ali or Tom Olner on our Tottenham Way podcast, because they do, you know, they have supported Tottenham, they can out of the air just think of anything that they don't have to like go and read up about it for every sort of historical thing that happened to Spurs during their lifetime, because it's just ingrained in them. So I suppose that makes it slightly harder not having those reference points automatically in my brain. Often I'll look it up and be like, oh yeah, I remember that, but it's not as quick as perhaps when you support them. But it also means that I suppose I'm a bit more neutral and dispassionate when it comes to the coverage of the actual games. I feel like doesn't bother me if you know, if they get a bad loss, it's not going to affect my mood. I'd rather, when you start covering a club a lot and you start to get to know people behind it to a certain extent, I suppose I'd rather they did well, but it won't really sort of bother me either way. And so maybe that helps, I suppose. Yeah, a long-winded answer.
Has the club ever been upset about something you've written?
Yeah, definitely. That's no, I'm not alone, and I think if that hadn't happened at all, that would be a good sign, really. If you'd been doing this job for more than 5 minutes, eventually something comes up which they don't like. But off the top of my head, I'm trying to think. Yeah, I'm not sure I want to mention that one. They're definitely, yeah.
We'll move on.
Yeah. There are definitely a few things.
You spoke about being in the press conferences with Ange. Now, I've spoken to many experts or many journalists that have covered his career since he started. Some of them say that they don't particularly like that he looks down in press conferences, doesn't give that eye contact. What do you make of that? Because there is a lot of criticism. We'll talk about the criticism in a minute for Ange from the fans' point of view, but a lot of journalists seem to have given him a lot of criticism as well, because that he doesn't look people in the eye. Does that bother you?
Well, okay. So first of all, I think that there's a big difference. So I don't think he does that in press conferences. In fact, I know, because that's where I'm in those presses asking him questions, and there's a bit of a distance between us. And I do actually think he does look me in the eye when I do that. What you're referring to, and which is clear, particularly when is the TV interviews. And when you're in a TV interview, as you'll know from doing lots of them, you know, just watching your reel before, you know, that Crouchy and Rio Ferdinand one, you're very close. I've done lots of them myself. Yeah. There's that sort of personal space element, and that's generally where he looks down a lot more. So I don't know if that's like I feel like you're always on slightly dodgy ground criticizing that, because maybe that's just something about his makeup that he can't help. I don't know this for a fact, but like if that were the case, people might feel bad about criticizing if they found out there was a reason why he was doing it, like isn't something he didn't want to do, but just how he is. But I could also, but if it is just literally just him doing it because he can't be bothered to look people in the eye, then I can totally understand why that would annoy particularly the reporter that's asking the questions. And doesn't make for great TV when you're, once again, the reporter is the conduit for the fan. You're on TV, you're sort of being the face of the club towards supporters. I can see how they wouldn't like that. But like I say, in press conferences, but maybe it's just literally the distance between us. It makes it easier. You know what it's like sometimes when you're right next to someone, constantly keeping that eye contact can be a bit more unnerving than if you're, I don't know, 10 feet away or something. So yeah, I sort of see it, but I don't really have that too much in my own experience.
Tom, what have you made of the job that Andrew's done? Because of course, when he came in, everyone was absolutely delighted. I know some people needed convincing, but after those 10 games in the Premier League, sitting top of the table, everyone seemed to have had a smile on their face, particularly with the type of football and the managers that we had before, being unsuccessful, again, not winning a trophy. How would you describe his time now? Because he seems to be getting a lot of criticism from the fans again.
Yeah, he is. And I think a lot of it is fair enough, because you have a job long enough, over the course of time, trends emerge, whether he accepts they are trends or not. And if they're not good trends, there are some really good positive things, in my opinion, that we can focus on. But if we're starting off with the negative side of it, you've got to face some music if it doesn't really well. But he's been the first person to say that. You know, his whole rhetoric about always winning a trophy in the second season, shooting for the stars, really. Like last season, he was talking about, after first place, it means nothing to him, all this kind of stuff, winning a cup, and the quote about when we're going to win, it's going to be glorious, all that kind of stuff. He said literally in press conferences to us that if he doesn't do that, it's totally fair cop, in his words, to be criticized for it. And until those things happen, he understands that he will have people be very skeptical that it will ever happen. I suppose the problem that he is having at the moment is, first of all, the inconsistency is really frustrating supporters. The timing of the inconsistency is awful. With international, it keeps happening ahead of international breaks, and there are a couple of performances that, at this stage of his tenure and the amount of players that have come in, are frankly a little concerning. You know, obviously Ipswich being one. I wasn't at that game. I wasn't at the Palace one either. Maybe I'm a lucky charm. I don't know, but obviously I've watched them, and it's the lack of competitiveness. A bit like, as he said, I was at the Brighton one. That was definitely memorable. In the second half, what shocked him so much about that performance was the lack of competitiveness. And like you can blame the players for it, and Tottenham have got a history of it that you can sort of look into, where this kind of thing has happened before. Specifically with Brighton, throwing away a 2-goal lead. The stats were all there for people to see. The first Premier League club to reach double figures doing that. But he obviously has to take flack for it as well. And I also think, like I say, I am a fan of Ange, and we'll come on to this. But if we're sticking with the things that I feel like it's fair cop to criticize him for, I do feel a couple of times he's made rods for his own back, unnecessarily so, with some of the comments he's had, which is ironic, because I think a big part of his appeal, particularly in the first place, was how he gave it to you straight. He was the person that you felt like you could connect to, and I still feel that, and I still really appreciate, as a journalist, that attribute that he has. But there were a few things. So obviously the set pieces one last season, when it wasn't even that big a deal at the time, like the stats weren't great, but they weren't awful. And I remember being the presser about that, and I think he's changed a bit on this, but there were times last season where, and he's definitely not alone when it comes to managers feeling this way, but a journalist kind of suggests something to him, and he kind of doesn't like taking or he didn't like then having to take sort of feedback that, almost like constructive criticism, I suppose, or questioning of his methods, and we kind of dismiss it. And I think that's kind of what happened with the, essentially, as it got portrayed, I don't care about set pieces stuff. But it was, for someone who's such a master generally at the PR side of things, at being able to express himself in a way that people can really connect to, it felt like a bit of a mistake. And then obviously after that, then they had like the Arsenal game last season where they can see, the header from Havertz and more set piece issues. And then it sort of escalated, and it was, it was the archetypal football mountain out of a molehill, which it seemed unnecessary. And then the other, and so that didn't help. And that's something that's even this season, whilst the stats actually aren't terrible for conceding goals from set pieces, albeit, for example, the Ipswich game, I got a mate of mine who's a big Ipswich fan. He was saying all season they haven't really had much of a threat from set pieces, and then they came to Tottenham, and even though I don't think they scored from one, it felt like suddenly they had a threat in that game that they hadn't had before, and that sort of speaks to, I think, a certain vulnerability in Tottenham's team when it comes to set pieces. It's still, anyway, even though it hasn't been as big a deal this season, it's something that keeps cropping up, and I think that's because of the comments he had last season, which he's tried to row back on. But once something's said and becomes a thing, it almost becomes a reference point that it's hard, particularly for journalists, not to go back, and therefore fans, to go back to time and again. So that was one thing that I feel was, if he could do it again, he'd probably do differently. And then obviously the other one was that bizarre game against Man City, where I did feel for him, and because it's so unique, wasn't it? I mean, well, funny enough, wasn't it Man United in '99, where it was actually a similar scenario, I suppose, where if they'd won at Old Trafford, then I think Arsenal might have won the league that year. But anyway, like, hardly ever happens. And he obviously wants his team to win. He's a competitor. He doesn't come with the sort of Tottenham history like every fan does. And I got it from everyone's perspective, but maybe his initial dismissiveness of any Spurs fan who might actually genuinely want their team to lose as being just ridiculous, that at the time felt a bit like that didn't go down particularly well with Spurs fans. And suddenly from then, this absolute loving that so many of them had with I'm loving Big Ange instead and all that kind of stuff frayed a little bit. And I didn't mean that you couldn't get it back. And ultimately it was because their results weren't great at the time either. But yeah, I think those are the two things that maybe have caused this kind of less of a sort of willingness to give him time to turn things, or to get his methods fully across from the supporters. But ultimately, as I said, it comes down to results, and there have been some this season, and obviously a lot at the back end of last season, which frustrated supporters so much that's probably where I'm at. On the negative side with Ange. So the long answer again. Sorry about that.
I was going to say, Tom, it's fair to say Ange Postecoglou walked into an absolutely huge job.
Yeah.
How big a job is this? Because the mentality, you've spoken a little bit about the mentality there, especially about that Manchester City game. How hard is that going to be for Ange Postecoglou to change so much at the football club, and most importantly, get the time and patience? Because it seems like some of the fan base, they don't have the time and patience at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always loath to criticize supporters. Like, again, my friends who go, they're season ticket holders, home and away. They went to Istanbul. They spend a lot of money. But as Ange has consistently said, like, fans are allowed to feel whatever they want to feel about these kind of things. And I think that's one of the things when it comes to his rhetoric, I suppose, he is generally quite consistent about certain things. And if you're at these press conferences week in, week out, like obviously I am, or like you watch and post the whole thing, then you can sort of see why for example, I saw your post the other day sort of backing him, and obviously I'm generally quite pro him for a lot of reasons which we can come on to. But maybe if you only hear, but most fans won't do that, and not understandably so. Like, why would you follow? Most people won't follow every single second, and so if they only see little clips here and there of him being, I don't know, narky after a game or set pieces, whatever, then it's sort of, that's the stuff that people remember. And if they start turning, then that doesn't help. But yeah, overall with Tottenham, I mean, first of all, you got to remember what he came into. They sold Harry Kane, like, with the day, 2 days or whatever it was before that Brentford game. He knew that was going to happen. He presumably talked about it before he took the job, even though he hasn't I don't know if he ever admitted that, but surely when you're being hired, that was the plan. As he said, he always thought it was going to happen. But that doesn't mean it makes it any easier to try and replace. He's had, and then Richarlison, who was at the time when he was signed, on reflection, I think was thought of as being the replacement long term, hasn't proved to be up to it, mainly physically, from his injuries. So he's had issues with that. And, a lot of squad churn and a whole new way of going about things, trying to impress a new philosophy, all this stuff. I think you have to give him leeway on that. Although ironically, it actually, he clicked straight away, didn't it? If anything, it's after those 10 games where the issues have started to really crop up.
Do you think he's going to get the time and patience from the board?
I hope so, but I suppose when you look at historically, this club haven't been the most overly patient of clubs when it comes to their managers in recent times. And when you look at the current, I suppose if you're going on the current ratio of defeats to amount of games played in the league, presume probably be another one at Man City, although Tottenham, and this is part of the reason why I'm a big Ange fan, is I feel like on his day he can beat anyone with his style, and so particularly, and City not having a great time at the moment anyway. So I wouldn't be shocked, put it that way, if they went and got a result at the Etihad, just the way I wasn't shocked when Ipswich got a result at Tottenham either, to be honest. But I suppose if you carry on this kind of rate of defeats to matches played, it'd be hard to see anyone sort of staying in the job long term. It'd take quite a resolve that the board haven't really shown historically with managers to do that. But that doesn't mean that. But at this stage, as far as I'm aware, there's no sort of they seem to be very much behind him, to the point when I think there was a story a few weeks ago about him having the confidence of the board and all that kind of thing. And the word I heard was they were frustrated that was even a story, because as soon as you start talking in that way and having stories written that way, that normally means the manager's on shaky ground, even if at that point not. But like that might lead to it not working out so well. So I think we're a long way away from anything. I'd like to think, his famous last words, dramatic happening. But I'm mainly going off the history of not just this club, most clubs, and the rate of defeats at the moment. But I think there are lots of, I haven't come onto them yet, but there are lots of reasons to be optimistic. But it's those Palace and Ipswich defeats and the fact they've got some really tough fixtures left in this whole season. But that makes me slightly concerned, I suppose.
Come on, Tom, give me all the positives about Ange Postecoglou.
Yeah, I mean, away from how he handles himself with the media, in my experience, I know, as you said earlier, with maybe TV reporters less so, but with us, I feel like he's brilliant to talk to. But no, just his style of play. Like, remember where they were at? They obviously lost their best ever player. They had quite an aging side that needed a bit, or if not age profile, just players who've been there for a long time, needed a change, coming from a defensive style which worked elsewhere but didn't work at Tottenham, and a very unhappy camp, really. When I remember interviewing Christian Romero in Perth last summer, not the one just gone, the one before then, and he was quite open about the sort of fracture within the dressing room towards Conte, pretty much. So it wasn't a particularly happy camp at the time. And he's brought them all together. There are so many players that sort of really appreciate him for the way he goes about things. And ultimately, it's when they play football, they are a joy to watch when it's going well. And it's quite rare as a neutral that I go to a Spurs game and I'm bored. I definitely have had that before. So I guess I'm coming from a bit of a neutral's point of view. It's a lot of fun covering Spurs, like whether it's good or bad. And I know that isn't really what fans want to hear, because they want to hear them winning and it all going well. But it's definitely entertaining. And I think, as I said, originally with or a minute ago about how they can beat anyone on their day, that's the crux of it. I feel like which is what gives me confidence that if they stick with him, that they could win a cup this season, because they feel like a team that can beat anyone in a cup competition. They just don't feel like a particularly serious league side at the moment, because they're way too inconsistent, and you just don't know which kind of Spurs are gonna turn up each week. But they've got some good players. I think Solanke was a perfect signing for Postecoglou, and I don't feel like he's really properly got going yet to the where I think he really can get to. And even though he's played well so far, and yeah, it's all exciting to watch an attacking play. I just feel like he needs to, personally, I think he could do with a few tweaks here and there, and not to be quite as puritanical about his approach. Even if it has worked in other leagues, I do think it is a step up in the Premier League, and that's proven to be. I mean, Ipswich, no Spurs fan is gonna, be able to stomach a defeat at home to Ipswich. But look, they got some good players. They've got a really good manager. That's why I'm not shocked by it. So when they lost that game, but if you want to be properly competitive, you have to be winning those kind of matches. And I just feel like there might have to be a few little things that he changes that he would have been loath to do before.
Like what?
So for example, with Man City a couple of weeks ago when they won the League Cup, he was more happy to surrender the ball more often. He played in the second half. He had better. Obviously, Bentancur is suspended now, so that's a hammer blow, really. But Bentancur and Basuma suddenly played with two holders, which we had from what I'd seen, had rarely happened. And maybe you can just be a bit more horses for courses, I suppose. And it doesn't just have to be against the big teams, because as proven, the likes of Ipswich have moments in games where they will be dangerous. So a little less sort of, this is the only way we play. A bit more of that I'd like to see more often. And that might be, Porro and Udogie not always flying forward, because when it works, it's brilliant. But then when you think about it, maybe there was a certain element of no one had seen it really before. And that's why it was so successful in that beginning. But teams do naturally start to work teams out if you don't have other ways of going about things. And that's nothing against Ange Postecoglou. That's just the level of the managers and players and teams you're up against. You have to constantly evolve, as proven by Guardiola, Arteta, all the managers out there. Like Slot's going really well at the moment, but if they keep playing the same way all the time, although he has shown sort of tactical flexibility, it's not guaranteed to work every time. So a bit more of that. And then, set pieces, for example, I feel like that vulnerability that I was talking about, that still needs to be addressed. So there are little things that I think could be changed, but I think he's capable of doing it, definitely. And he's, a tactician who's created this brilliant style of play, who's had all kinds of experiences across football, right, not Premier League before now, but like with clubs that are within their respective division, nowhere near as good as what he left them. So that wasn't necessarily like being able to implement an amazing attacking style of play straight away. He's been doing this for a long time, so I think he's well capable of it. But my fear, I suppose, is if he sticks to only this one way, generally, then that might be exposed by the sheer amount of quality in this division.
I tell you, Tom, a couple of weeks ago, I had Vince Rugari on. It's in Australia. And after he came on, I thought, oh my God, we're going to win everything. Because he said, I've seen this all before, people doubting Ange all the time. A lot of people doubt him, but he always proves people wrong, doesn't he?
Well, that's what he has consistently said throughout his time, and I've asked a lot of those questions, almost teeing him up to basically say that kind of thing where, Japan, I mean, your audience and fans will probably be well versed in Ange's backstory now, because we were obsessed with it, particularly in those first 10 weeks, because it was such a different approach. No one really knew much about him. But yeah, I mean, Japan, for example, he takes over a team that are struggling, in threat of relegation. He doesn't even speak the language. He's having to do it by translators. He's got this, was it 40-year-old centre back who's like a legend of the club that he obviously couldn't get rid of, but was kind of holding him back in his whole approach of the high line and all that kind of stuff. And in the second season, he turned it around, and there were plenty of doubters then. Yes, it's not the same as the quality as the Premier League and the scrutiny from a global point of view, but it sounds like it's not like the Japanese were like, yeah, sure, just do whatever you want. They were pretty hard on him within that respective division over his approach. So yeah, he's constantly said as well, I'm used to this. I'm used to people doubting my philosophy. But I suppose as someone who is has generally bought into bought into him and that kind of thing. I think after about where I'm at personally, having watched it all from the moment he took over, from that first friendly against West Ham in Perth to where we're at now, I think he could do with a bit of tweaking. No, it doesn't mean you have to like bin off the whole like approach and your ideology and everything. It's just little tweaks here and there. Otherwise, I worry. And Vince, who I've met, is a great guy. Obviously, wrote the book on him. Will say differently, but I don't think it is dismissive and patronizing to say the Premier League is just another level. It is like. It's so hard. The players are so good. And I think he is really good as well. But I sometimes you have to mix it up.
Tom, do you get the feeling from the club? Because when you mentioned earlier about the club are very much behind Ange Postecoglou, do you get the feeling that it's going to be different this time and he's going to be backed more than any other manager, of the last 5 years? Because recording this podcast today, it's 5 years to the day since Pochettino was sacked. And since then, we've had 7 different managers, including Pochettino, in the dugout. We cannot keep hitting that reset button, can we, as a football club? It has to work at some point, and a manager has to have the time, the patience, and, of course, the tools and the funds.
Yeah, I mean, when you say backed, do you mean financially?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I thought Conte was pretty well backed in that summer I was talking about, going into career. Like whether he got the players he wanted is a different question, but like literally in terms of outlay, 60 million on Richarlison, Bissouma, and all the other players that came through the door, then it wasn't nothing. Maybe some Spurs fans will rail against that, but it's funny.
Sorry, I was going to say, I suppose some people don't see him as being fully backed when a manager comes out multiple times and says it was a club signing.
Yeah. So he was more about it, and I think that's fair. Like it feels like he didn't get the players that he quite wanted, but I mean, I'm talking purely from a sort of numbers game. I suppose I felt like they did spend quite a lot of money in that window. I mean, it wasn't like I wasn't really covering the club when they were going through that phase under Poch, where I mean, obviously I was very aware of it, where they weren't really spending. I know they were obviously buying the stadium, but it obviously back on reflection felt like the time where they should have
518 days without a signing.
Yeah, exactly. That was the time where they really, because the team was so good, but in need of either additions to bolster the squad or a few tweaks. For example, like Eric Dyer, who's a lovely guy who was one of the most remarkable interviews that I can remember when we did that in Singapore, which I can come on to another time, when he cried. Totally fair enough. I didn't mean to dismiss that, but wasn't expecting it at the time, I remember. But anyway, looking back on him, I remember there was a time where, I think Man United, there was talk of him, Mourinho wanting him for about 40 million. That would have been the time on reflection to cash in on him then and rebuild. Maybe there were some players that were thought of that they could stay the course and they weren't added to. So I totally understand all that, but specifically that summer, I felt like they did invest quite heavily. Just, I guess, your argument of whether it was the players he actually wanted. Yeah, that's a different. That's another argument and maybe fair criticism. Although if Conte feels like the kind of manager who will only strive for exactly what he wants, if he doesn't get it, he gets unhappy. And I remember being in that briefing where he called Jed Spence a club signing. We had 10 minutes with him after the game in where was the other place they went to that wasn't Seoul, like south of Seoul? I can't remember. Yeah, it was I forget which match it was against, and he brought it up completely of his own volition. It wasn't like a question about Jed Spence at all. So you knew something was up at that point. But with regarding Ange, I mean, like he himself publicly has constantly said that he wanted to go down this young player route. I mean, I will never know like whether he's saying that because I don't know, like whether the club want to sign young players or not. I generally do think he enjoys developing young players. We've asked before specifically, about spending big money on players, and he says personally, I'd rather spend 50 million twice than spend 100 million. I mean, a lot of this is said in a press conference, like whether he's actually telling the whole truth of what he thinks, but he says it with such seemingly authenticity that it does feel like how he wants to do it. Tottenham generally, their whole model has generally been buying young sort of potential rather than rather than sort of ready-made players, and that's just generally how they've done it. And I think they've reverted to that even more so this summer because they've had their fingers burnt by Tongi and Ndombele, for example, and other signings like that. But overall, when I look at the business in the summer, kind of how you said it, I think there's a lot to be excited about for the future, and some of those players are really exciting. But it felt like personally, and we'll never know. Wilson Odebear's had a nightmare with injury so far, so maybe if he'd been fit, he might have been electric from the beginning. And he had moments in that Newcastle game. Obviously, missed a good chance, but suggested like he's got, he was thrown straight in by Ange, which shows like how highly he rated him. But personally, it felt like a time to really go for a big, maybe not a big name, but like a top quality sort of wide forward to compete with Sonny and on the other side as well with Brennan, to sort of add that kind of consistency, because that's what you're seeing, I suppose. It's not his style; it's the young players. Like I've seen it loads. We all seen it. The young players are inconsistent by their very nature, so it's probably not that much of a shock we're seeing this topsy-turvy season.
I suppose that's where a lot of frustration comes from, though, Tom, because the amount of podcasts we recorded during the summer transfer window, and every single person on the show was saying we need players for now. We're all excited about players for the future, and I can see exactly what the club are trying to do. But for this season, you need players for now. What are the chances of Postecoglou and Spurs signing players for now to walk into the team to be game changers from the bench?
Well, I mean, Johan Lange did that interview, didn't he? After the window closed, and he said quite specifically that last summer was about bolstering, improving the first team specifically, and this one was about improving the squad. So that kind of told you really what you needed to know, I suppose, that they were looking to, particularly with Europe coming on, it was more about that filling out of the squad rather than specifically trying to improve first team starters. Having said that, they spent more than anyone else in the whole of the Premier League on one player in Dominic Solanke. So that shouldn't be dismissed. 65 million was the highest transfer fee this summer. I just feel personally that maybe they were short of another top signing in those forward positions. There's a good line from my mate Dan Kilpatrick from our podcast on Tottenham Way, where he sort of suggests it feels a bit like Spurs are sort of building for the post-Pep time at City. Like obviously he's dominated so much and he's going through a tricky period at the moment. But when he goes, you would have thought there'd be an inevitable drop off when it comes to City, and suddenly it becomes more wide open. And I kind of buy into that, because you look at the signings, it does feel very much for the future. But I can totally understand why it's frustrating from a Spurs fan point of view.
Tom, how long do you think Ange will be Spurs manager? Barring like a complete drop off and a bad run, and they've got some hard fixtures coming up where the club feel like they have to do something. I can definitely see him being here next season, this time next year. Yeah, definitely, because I feel like they are backing his whole approach. And like I say, when it goes well, I mean, they lost to Ipswich, but the previous two games they won 4-1 at home, both the games. Yeah.
And I know I suppose the difficult thing with those defeats to Crystal Palace, to Brighton, to Ipswich, is not only are they like really demoralising, unexpected, and just pretty poor performances as well. There's nothing positive about them. They make you reassess all the wins that came before it as well. Like, you make you go, well, actually, was it as convincing? Like, was it just like a little 20-minute spell? What did they get away with it? Were their chances missed by their team? And that's a bit unfair, because again, the level of the Premier League means most teams, even if they're going through a bad patch, think of West Ham, all the money they've spent, will have, and the players they've got, they will have chances. And Ange, by his own admission, the way he plays, he knows they're going to give chances away. Like, he accepts that. That's part of the dice that he rolls with his whole approach. But it is frustrating, like, to suddenly to have that after you get those defeats, and that's. I think that's another reason why some supporters, are, if some are losing faith, it would be for those reasons. But I think generally from the club's point of view, they want this to work. They're encouraged by what they've seen when it's been going well. They know that last season was going to be a tricky one, having sold their best ever player, which was not going to go down well. I mean, during that season, the amount of times people didn't really talk about the fact that they've sold Harry Kane in the summer, even if like, you know, from a business point of view, it's probably the right thing to do rather than lose him for free with the money they brought in. It's still like you've sold your best ever player, who you've created, who didn't win anything, arguably because the club didn't. Maybe because the club should have been, you know, invested more in the team earlier, whatever reason you want to talk about. And because he was doing so well and the performance was so entertaining, it was rarely mentioned. And I think that gets overlooked. But I suppose with stats can show you anything. And when people start looking at the amount of times this year they've gone behind at home, you know, that is frankly a really worrying statistic. And you know, defeats towards the end of last season, then that doesn't help. But overall, I think there's reasons to be positive. Yeah.
Tom, do you think Harry Kane will return to Spurs one day?
Well, he comes back every other week, doesn't he, when at England when he comes to do his presses? I don't know really. Like, I mean, he wants to play. He said the other day, didn't he, that he still sees his England future being post the World Cup. And it was funny. I was at the game. Did you go to the Republic of Ireland match?
I didn't. I'm normally at every single England game, but I didn't make the place.
So we were watching it, and obviously in the press box, and the talk of the first at half time, because it was a pretty poor game at that point. The main talking point was Harry, because obviously he'd been left out, dropped, whatever Lee wants to call it, for the first game. It's a surprise, whatever. And he's come back in, and he just looked to be. He just wasn't having a great game. He looked a bit lumbering, which is, to be honest, what he did during the Euros throughout that as well. It just didn't look physically right, despite him constantly saying that he felt, you know, the peak of his form. You sort of looked at it and thinking, how is this going to quite work going forward, particularly, and I still worry about this from his point of view, not worry, but if I was him, I'd still be concerned about it. It feels like Jude Bellingham's now, the torch has been passed. He's now the talisman of the team. And when he's got runners all around him, you know, not only the wide lads in Gordon and Madueke for this particular camp, but Watkins ahead of him, it feels like he can do his stuff, as Ian Wright would put it, even more than he does in any other team. And it really sort of plays to his strengths. So in that first half, when there wasn't really a lot of click between the two of them, and his touch was off it, and he wasn't really getting involved in the game, it only sort of fed more into that narrative. And then within 5 minutes of the second half, he plays that unbelievable pass to Jude Bellingham, who wins the penalty, he puts it away. And it just reminds you, like, he's just so good. So personally, I think he's definitely got a role to play for it. I know it's not a question, but for England for a long time to come, it's just whether he's always starting or whether Tuchel, when he comes in, starts to look at every individual match and uses them in different ways. But for Spurs, I mean, obviously his main target is finally winning a trophy. Bayern have had a good start, so hopefully from his point of view, I'd like to think most Spurs fans won't have Schadenfreude when it comes to Harry Kane, and hopefully in time they will really appreciate him if they don't already, and he can win that major trophy. And then once that's done, and then we'll still have 2 years left on his Bayern contract, and he's on absolutely enormous wages, which Spurs could never pay or wouldn't pay, or maybe could never pay, but they wouldn't pay now, and they definitely wouldn't for a 33-year-old, would he be by the end of it, or 34? He's 31 now, isn't he? So we're 34. So I go back at, but he's opened the door when he left, didn't he? I guess it depends on the style of play by the time, but by the time if he were ready to come back after that, where Tottenham were at, because the way they play now, I don't know if it would suit him as much, but I'd like to think so. Another long-winded answer. I'd love to see Harry back.
Tom, going back to the whole time and patience for Postecoglou, and when I mentioned about Pochettino being sacked 5 years ago today, when you look at Pochettino, Jose Mourinho, Antonio Conte, three fantastic managers at the football club, failed to be successful by winning trophies at Spurs. What do you think the club have learnt during that last 5 years in terms of giving Ange the time, perhaps, because some of these managers haven't necessarily had the time that some of them probably deserved?
Well, Conte kind of torched everyone and everything and kind of made himself be sacked, wouldn't you say, with that press conference and so on? So, I mean, it felt like there was no coming back from that, and it felt like what he wanted to happen. So I think you kind of take him out of it, to be honest, of this particular.
Were you in that press conference?
No, I was outside. I was speaking to Oliver Skip in the mix zone at that point.
Wow.
Yeah. So I got a text from my mate Chris Wise at BBC, who said, "I've just done this like crazy interview with Conte for the TV interviews," and then obviously that got completely like blown out of the water by his eruption in the main presser, where I think it was Dan's question in particular, Kilpatrick again, name checked him a bunch of times tonight, who set him off on his rant. But yeah, that felt like it was a bit of a different situation, maybe. Jose, I mean, do we ever? Again, this is before my time, but it is still baffling why he was sacked just before the cup final. I don't know if we've ever heard publicly what the proper reason for. Everyone's got their theories, or what you can tell is the amount of comments or digs that Jose's had since, whenever talking about Spurs, and particularly the ownership, compared to all the other clubs he's been at. So I guess you can draw your own conclusions on how he felt on that one. But yeah, Poch is the sad one, isn't it? Because he's so, or was until Chelsea, I suppose, so beloved by the fan base. Really took the club from not mediocrity, because obviously Harry a few years before had got them to the Champions League, and they developed into a big club. I mean, I'm trying to remember now, when Poch took over, was Spurs, we talk about the big six, which is kind of changing now, to be honest, with Newcastle and Aston Villa, but I suppose still there's this sort of element of it. Were Spurs at the start of Poch's reign, was the talk of the big six a thing at that point, or was it something that sort of developed throughout as he got better and better? Absolutely,
it developed.
Yeah. So that in itself is probably the biggest compliment you can pay to what a job he did. That suddenly they became one of the select few massively influential, revered clubs in England, who were brilliant to watch. Could defended well. Obviously, had some unbelievable players, and that seems a different one, really. But I don't know. Managers don't often last as long as he did. Wonder if some people might think it might have run its course, but I can't help, as a sort of neutral looking back, thinking, just reached Champions League final not that long before. He definitely feels like he deserved more time at the time.
Tom, talking about transfers, and you've already mentioned that Ange Postecoglou has said a number of times that he doesn't necessarily go out and spend a lot of money on superstars, if you like. The stadium, when it opened in April 2019, was meant to be a game changer, and a lot of this money going on the pitch. Do you ever see that happening?
I mean, obviously there's financial fair play now, so that does make a difference. But this is the biggest sort of bugbear, isn't it, of Spurs fans towards the ownership. Will they ever spend the way that Chelsea or the other big six clubs do? Probably not, to be honest. You can only judge, judge a horse on the races it's run, and as the cliche goes, and that's kind of what they've done historically. I would say, as I said before, in the last few windows, it's not like they've spent nothing. They've been, obviously Solanke, as I said before, that summer with Conte. Generally during my time, there's been a lot of transfer signings to write about with, decent figures next to them. And it's not just like all free transfers or loans or whatever. I remember that time when Harry was in charge, and I remember going to Tottenham, watching Tottenham Newcastle, watching my Newcastle team get battered 5-0. I remember that game. But it was around the time when the England talk was around Harry, when you know how it ended. But that window, I think they signed Louis Saha on free or on loan, and Ryan Nelson, wasn't it? I mean, yeah. I don't think we really see that anymore. I mean, Drăgușin last January was decent money, a player who was wanted by Bayern Munich. These are well, on paper, and I think we can come on to Radu Drăgușin. He's quite a specific case, because I'm not convinced. I don't know what you think so far from what I've seen. But when they signed him, so just to finish the point, when they signed him, that was like not a statement signing, but it wasn't a signing of it wasn't like a freebie or something. It was beating a top club to supposedly one of the most exciting centre backs going around in Europe at the time. So I'm it's not like I'm loath to criticize the hierarchy for, on that front, but I do have to say that during my time of covering them, it's not, I don't think it's, if it wasn't for the baggage of all those years where they haven't spent the money, if you look at these particular years in isolation that I've been doing it, there are definitely other clubs that have been way worse off. I mean, Newcastle, for example, I know they're hamstrung by FFP in the summer, but they didn't buy anyone really, did they? There is a bit of balance there, but I'm aware that probably goes down like an absolute lead balloon with a lot of supporters.
Tom, of course, you talk to a lot of people. Have you spoken to Radu's agent?
I've spoken to him. Not for a while. I'm not going to be that journalist who comes on here and criticizes agents for giving us good stuff to write about. Definitely, and he does have his fair share of things to say. But I can see how Tottenham fans might not be best pleased with every time Radu's not in the team. Suddenly stories crop up about moves back to Serie A, or literally his agent on the record talking about frustration of not being in the team. But I mean, this is the conversation. We're talking about Radu Drăgușin. I don't know if he really deserves it based on how he's been playing. I mean, I've been at a lot of his games. I remember was it his debut or full debut at Fulham? Got absolutely torn apart by Rodrigo Muniz. He was in a great vein of form at the time. Fulham a good team, but it's his debut. Like, there's lots of particularly defence centre backs coming from foreign clubs who take a while to settle, and he was good against City in the League Cup. Albeit that was a game where it was kind of backs against the wall, a lot of heading and kicking away, which does seem to suit him. It's not. What I'm slightly yet to be convinced by, I suppose, is how fitting he is for Ange's style. Like, I know it's hard when you're going for a third choice centre back, unless they really think Romero might leave at some point. I'm not saying he's going to, but there's rumours every so often about Barcelona and Real Madrid. But unless they really thought of him as being like the succession plan to centre back, there generally trying to get a third choice centre back in, no matter what Ange says about not having any nailed on starters, is a tricky signing. It's not easy to fill that position, but generally I'm in possession. He's not set the world alight, and that feels like a big part of Ange's style. He's not got electric pace like obviously Van de Ven. I mean, unbelievable. So it's not really fair to compare him to that. But it does feel like having centre backs who are quick is a good asset to this particular way that they play. So he doesn't really have that. He's good in the air. But he's had some questionable decisions. I don't think it was not a moment of madness when he got sent off against Karabag, but did he really need to make that decision at that point? Kind of got himself into an awkward position. I mean, it's a one-off moment, so it seems a bit harsh to like hammer him on one particular thing. But I just don't feel like I've seen many games where I've been like, wow, okay, I totally see why he was brought in and why he's the future. But look, still, it's less than a year. There are players that I can think of. I don't know why he comes to mind, but like Colaccini at Newcastle, he ended up getting relegated, but then he came back, and it took him a few years to really get settled, and then he became a bit of a sort of like cult hero of that Newcastle. I mean, that Newcastle team we're nowhere near where Spurs are at now, but maybe in time it can happen for him. But I'm yet to sort of really be convinced, I suppose. What do you think of Radu Drăgușin so far?
Well, we haven't seen a lot of him, but from what I've seen so far, I agree with you about the pace. I don't think that he's got enough pace. And to fit into this Ange Postecoglou system, I do have a lot of question marks. But I suppose we do need to see a lot more of him. And I am surprised by a lot of the comments coming out of the mouth of his agent, because, of course, he does big him up so much. But, the player needs to do the talking on the pitch, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Tom, let's get your thoughts and views on the Heung-min Son contract situation, because it now looks like they're going to activate this extension for 1 year. Is it true that Son is disappointed by not being offered a brand new long-term deal?
I don't know that. I tried to find out, look into that, and the feedback I got from at least someone relatively close to his representatives, I suppose, was they hadn't heard that. But that doesn't mean, and I never would knock down stories generally anyway of other journalists. It's the right thing to do. But it's not like I know it's wrong and just don't want to say. Like I just don't know on that one. I mean, from Spurs' point of view, I mean, exercising the option seems quite makes sense, doesn't it? Really, yeah. I mean, it's hard. I know he's like club legend, even though he doesn't feel like he's a legend yet until he wins something. It just shows what a legend he is, really, in his personality. But you know, he's obviously, you know, if it's not 10 years, it's almost there. You know, literally from calendar years that he's been there. Every time I write about Son, every time he scores, I'm checking the Premier League all-time goal scorers list to see where he's moved to. I think he's joint 19th? I know he's level with. Who was he level with last? It wasn't Defoe. Defoe's a bit ahead of him. But anyway, so obviously great players, unbelievable player. But where he's at in his career and his age, and where Tottenham wants to go, signing him up to another 3-4 year contract doesn't feel like maybe the shrewdest move any club would make, and it doesn't feel like the kind of thing that Spurs would do. So maybe if it is correct that he's disappointed, I understand that because of the loyalty that he's shown Spurs. But personally, if I was in charge, I don't think exercising an option for another year, given that's like 18 months away by the time that ends, if it was exercised right now, is a crazy decision. What do you think?
I love Son. I'll tell you what, if he's another player to leave our football club and not win a trophy, I'd be absolutely devastated for him. But I'd like to see him stay at the club for as long as possible. Yeah, it'd be an interesting one.
How do you think if he were to theoretically sign a 3-year deal, and he's not as quick as he was, he has his moments like West Ham. Like he's a brilliant player. He's a brilliant player who's underrated. I mean, the fact that we always, whenever he's up for, or whenever people talk about him, a question that creeps into all of our minds is to ask about how underrated he is. That tells its own story, that people just generally don't see him away. I don't know whether that's the fact that, you know, a sort of bigotry towards South Korean, or just I don't know what it is, or the fact he hasn't won anything because of being at Tottenham and they haven't won. I don't know what it is, but he's a brilliant player. But you know, as the years go on, like what we're talking about with Harry for England, like he will get slower. And would you see him becoming more of a number 10 or playing back up front again if he can't have that blistering pace that wide? But I ask particularly because if Ange is to, you know, the long-term solution, it all works out as I think you and I sort of hope does. He's so reliant on rapid pace out wide, hence why Kulusevski, he's been an absolute revelation coming inside, because, you know, the amount of times you see him out wide, he's too predictable, not really quick enough, to be honest, the way they like to play. He's done better in the middle, and if Son loses even more pace in 2 years, say if it was a 3-year deal, then I don't really see where he would fit out wide.
I'll tell you what though, Tom, even to have Son as a sub and have that game changer, which I feel that we have missed for the last couple of years, game changers off the bench, because the squad depth has never been where we want it or need it to be in order to progress and move on to that next level. And I always feel like we need that quality. So even to have someone like Son with that ability to be able to shoot, and, you know, look at that cross in that Villa game, putting on the plate for Brennan Johnson. You know, you don't get players very often delivering that sort of cross. Unbelievable.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, he's, like I say, I said before, he's one of the best players to ever play in the Premier League. Like, he's up there. I mean, I don't think I'd have him in my all-time 11, but he might be on the bench. He's that good.
Some people have criticised making Son captain, and whenever we lose a game, particularly this season, and Postecoglou gets heavily criticised by the fan base, a lot of Spurs fans come out and say we haven't got any leaders. Who do you see as leaders, Tom, in this Tottenham squad?
Well, this is something that we asked Ange about specifically after the Brighton game, I think ahead of the next game, where, like I said, in the aftermath of, minutes after a game, it's not the best time to speak to them, whether they've won or lost, really, but particularly after that match. But let the dust settle. And that was 2 weeks of dust settling, unfortunately, with the international break after that game. And it felt like a fair question about leaders and where they're going to come from. And he accepted the premise of people questioning where those leaders are. And his answer, as you might remember, was that everybody can be a leader. You can be a leader with, you can be the youngest player in the team and do one action, which can basically inspire others. So I do think when it comes to captains, we have this kind of, in our mind's eye, we have this image of Roy Keane and Patrick Vieira and maybe Steven Gerrard, slightly in a different way, more like scoring unbelievable goals, like, taking responsibility in that way. And there just aren't that many of them, particularly in the modern game. So it's kind of a bit of a...
Why?
I just don't know whether...
Why?
I don't know. I mean, maybe players are just different. You just don't get those kind of...
Yeah.
Maybe it's the fact that Roy Keane did everything. Like back then, there was a bit of players, as you often say, I was midfielder, I went back, I went forward. It wasn't like I just defense. People have more like specific tasks and jobs now in games. I don't know what it is, or maybe the mentality of players has changed. I'm not sure. I mean, like Hugo Lloris was a leader, but he was a goalkeeper, which I always find, I don't know how that works, to the forward players, in the same way that people have issues with strikers being. They prefer them to be centre backs or midfielders around that area. But anyway, back to the team, whether I do feel like there is enough leadership there. I mean, I don't know. It just feels like an obvious thing to look at when a team throws away a game in the manner that they did. Like that feels like a prime occasion where you needed someone to really grip the situation on the pitch. And you could argue Ange maybe off the pitch could have done more in that particular game. And I do think it was fair to maybe criticise his lack of substance in that game, because even more so when 2 weeks later he was reflecting on that game and was basically saying, the reason it didn't work out was because we weren't running enough, which is fair to say, later on he'd seen the data and then realised, but actually he also said that in the moment he sensed that was the problem. So if you were thinking that was the problem at the time, why didn't you effectively change something at the time? He didn't make the subs at that particular period. So I think that is a fair criticism as a side point on that one. But it also, could have been down to players to have shown more leadership. And he's often talked about Romero. He's a huge fan of Romero. Like, you never hear him generally criticize him at all, even though there have been moments where Romero has had difficult or moments where he could have done slightly better. But he's also talked about Romero's not like a big sort of screamer and shouter. He's more of those sort of a defender who leads by example. So maybe they could have more of those in the team. But again, it comes back to my point where the modern game, do players respond in the same way as they once did? I mean, if by all accounts, Keane, when he tried to take his approach when it came to management, it didn't work, and that's maybe the modern player has changed. So it's a bit of a wider conversation. But I mean, do you sense there's a lack of leaders in this team? Is that something that does worry you?
Like I said, Tom, I think in the summer transfer window, I would have preferred more established players, older players. But, players like Maddison, for me, they need to step up. They need to do a lot more. They need to show a lot more leadership. And Andrew's absolutely right in what he says. A lot of these players, can take the leadership. They can step up, but they've got to do it on a consistent basis. But I do believe that he needs a little bit more help in the transfer window.
I think,
and I don't want to be one of those. I don't want to be one of those fans saying, "Oh, we just need to go out and spend money." I'm not one of those. I do get the fact that a manager needs to develop players, but some of these players do need to do it themselves as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, he talked about Maddison recently, didn't he? He said he needs to give basically compelling, was the quote? I was off during this time, but I think I read the quote as like, he needs to provide compelling evidence to show why he should be both in the Spurs team and in the England team. And Maddison's had sort of fits and starts this season, but just hasn't really happened as much of late. And, he, by his own admission, he loves being the main man. He likes to be, I forget what the quote was, something about like, carving the roast on a Sunday dinner. I think it was a quote on England duty about how he likes to be the guy. So if he wants to be that guy, he needs to, and he'll know this, he needs to step up. But so I think that's fair. I mean, on the transfer market, I mean, Destiny Udogie's performances this season, particularly in that Brighton game, obviously that was real nightmare, but he feels like he's dropped off at times this year, and that's where maybe you could argue they could have brought in another left back. I did think at the start in the summer, because of how specific those fullback positions are to the way he wants to play, meaning that Ben Davies has been kind of sort of no longer thought of, it seems, as a left back. He's a pretty good left centre back, actually, in this system, to the point where recently I've almost been like, why not play him ahead of Drăgușin personally? But a left back, he's no longer really thought of in that way. And if the other options are going to be right, Archie Gray, who's been, I think, really good so far, but has been sort of dotting in here and everywhere, or Jed Spence playing out of position as well, then given how important that role is, particularly from an attacking point of view, I think that's fair criticism that they maybe could have signed somebody else in that position to give more competition to Udogie. He's a really good, exciting young player, but he's having a bit of a rough time at the moment. And on that point, I mean, I remember being quite surprised when I sort of found out, I suppose, that they weren't going to try and pursue that. I just didn't see it really as a priority where to spend their money this summer. And I do think that's something that's overlooked is FFP, as much as people hate it, and Spurs fans probably hate that more than anything because it just feels like it's giving the ownership an out. But it is a reality that they have to contend with, and you have to work out where you want to spend your money. But you could argue that having competition in that position, given how important it is, maybe could have been higher up on the priority list.
Tom, what is going to be the priority? Because I know Ange said in the presser recently, I want to win it all, mate. But of course, we haven't won a trophy now for 16 plus years. Trophies are way overdue. The fans clearly want a trophy. I know Ange has spoken out, at length to you guys many times about the need, for the fans to win trophies. But, he's always talking about long term. Do you think that the club share Ange's vision with, league position, cups? What do you think the priority is going to be this season for Ange? Because when we look at the Europa League, for example, and the amount of changes that he's made in these competitions, do you think he's going to have to at some point go stronger in the Europa League to, in order to go all the way? But then when you look at that Galatasaray game, the amount of change that he made, how difficult it was. We could have been 5-6 down at some point. Yeah.
I mean, that game was, I'm still trying to get my hearing back, to be honest, from that match. The deafening whistles of the Galatasaray fans. But I said at the time when I was doing my YouTube afterwards, it felt like that game had become a bit of a free hit because of how well they'd done in the previous, or results-wise, in the three previous games. He obviously had rolled the dice to a certain extent by playing younger players, but they'd come away with 3 victories. And in this new format of this Europa League phase, you have that opportunity to continue to do that if you get those results. And Galatasaray was a prime example. There was, I think it was kind of it definitely expected that he would do it, but also he had given himself the wriggle room to continue to do it because of the previous results. That doesn't mean that when it comes to the knockouts, which I'm pretty convinced, at this stage they take an absolute disaster for them not to get through at this stage, but they will get through, that he won't go stronger. But that's a different phase of the competition. And at the moment, it's about managing their way through a tricky period. Obviously, what completely undermines all that is then they go and lose to Ipswich a few days later, doesn't it? So, so people aren't going to stomach that rotation as much when it doesn't seem to have paid off at all when it comes to the Premier League game. I think the Premier League is always going to be the most important. Back to talking about Daniel Levy and us not really getting to speak to him, you can only go off what he does say publicly and try and read into certain things, as from the few times we get to hear from him. And it was quite was it from the fans forum where he was talking about the amount of games being an issue, and he specifically points to the extra cup competition that we have in England compared to other competitions. So that can pretty much tell you what he thinks of the League Cup. really, as a club. So which is disappointing to a certain extent, because I know it doesn't come with any kind of financial clout, and that's what it really comes down to with all these owners really and clubs when it comes to that competition. And don't just focus on Tottenham, because I'm bored of the FA Cup now generally, because not even the League Cup, the FA Cup, because I've been to so many games where I'm watching Championship side versus Championship other side who are like mid-table, who make 11 changes, and you're like, why should the fans care as much when no one is caring within the clubs, and so that's definitely not just a Spurs thing. Newcastle, to come back to them, have done that many times when they haven't won anything for 1,000 years compared to Tottenham, right? So it's definitely not a unique thing just to Spurs, but those comments were quite telling towards that competition. I'd like to think the Europa League will be different though, because obviously it's a route into the Champions League, and it does come with if they could actually go and win it, which really does feel like a achievable thing for Spurs. You said for a long time, I bet it was my friend Tom Allnight who said Tottenham could be almost like the Sevilla of the Premier League to a certain extent when it comes to Europe. Like, it's obviously they would aspire to more, and they have been in the Champions League, but kind of where they are in the packing order to a certain extent, there's no reason why they couldn't go and win that competition every year. And people can dismiss it from the outside as much as they want, but I mean, imagine if you got to go and watch Tottenham go and win that Europa League. I'm not quite sure where the final is, I'd have to look it up, but I mean, that would be a memory that fans would have forever. It would be unbelievable.
It's in Bilbao, and
Bilbao. Brilliant.
I know a lot of people who have booked the flight already.
Have they? Wow. San Sebastian's not far as well. That's supposed to be lovely. So yeah, fingers crossed.
Tom,
I mean, that feels good.
I'd be hoping for a League Cup final first, but let's get your opinion on that. How strong do you think that Postecoglou will go in the Manchester United quarter-final? Because I see this as a huge game, and I tell you what, from my point of view, and a lot of people I know, their attitude will then change if Spurs go out of cup competitions, because cup competitions mean a lot to the fans. Do you think that Postecoglou and the club realise how important it is? It might not be important to them by just winning a League Cup, but it is very important to the fans.
I think Ange will do, definitely. And I agree. I do think if people are sort of, umming and ahhing generally about it, a lot of the stock that they put into the sort of pro Ange point of view is the fact that they, like I said from the off, it feels like on their day they can beat anyone, and it does feel very achievable to win a cup. It does, our managers gone by, it felt like probably not, but this one definitely feels like you can. But then, like you say, if you go out of them, then you're left with a sort of up and down inconsistent Europa League form, and that's not as that feels a lot more shaky ground. I've just told you what I feel like the club priority are generally on that competition based on what what has been said publicly. So maybe different for them, but yeah, I agree. I mean, back to that comment you were saying earlier that Ange says he wants to win it all. I remember being in that presser, and that was his like clever way of answering a question that you kind of on hiding to nothing. Would you rather come? I think it was Moose actually who asked him. Who asked lots of great questions. So it's not criticism, but it was basically like, would you rather win a trophy or finish in the top four? And he knows the crowd pleasing one, but that was an easy way of getting out of it. But what was interesting is, and I was thinking about this when you were asking me about, was that last season he was really dismissive of fourth, fifth, all this kind of thing. The importance of it. And now it's all about first, and first only is the only important thing. And he was all about trying to be in a position to win the league at the end of this season, really, is what he was saying last year. I mean, obviously that's not going to happen anyway. But since this season, I feel like it's not like he's explicitly, changed the narrative. But when questions, like there was a question about ahead of Villa, or maybe even after Villa, actually, after the Villa game, where they won, so he was in quite a good mood. It was asked about the race for fourth place, and where last year it felt like it was a straight shootout between Villa and Spurs, and this time it was. Does it feel like the field is stronger? You got likes of Bournemouth going well, Brighton, Newcastle, all that kind of thing. And it wasn't like last year he would have been like, I don't care, I just want to win the league, that's what I got my goal on. And this time he gave quite a considered response, about it. So, which I think I don't want to criticize him for, but it almost felt like he wouldn't have done that last year. This year is almost like not an acceptance that's probably the best they can hope for in the league, which is realistic, to be honest, if that is how he's gone about it. But that felt like an interesting little shift. In the same way that after the Ipswich game, I thought his comments about how he, his approach, he may have to look at it and fix things. I thought that was the first time that I've heard him, hint at potentially tweaking things like I was suggesting. I thought would be a good idea. I haven't heard that from him either before. But I do agree definitely that I think there's a lot of weight suddenly on these cup competitions. And personally, I hope he pulls it off, because come back to it. It's great entertaining football, and I don't personally know where you would go from Ange. That's the sort of $1 million question. Is
totally agree.
Where next? I mean, I people might say Andoni Iraola is probably one of the obvious ones because he's doing well at Bournemouth. He obviously had Solanke, did really well. It feels quite a fitting kind of Spurs appointment. It's very similar to Poch from Southampton. Literally South Coast. I mean, Bournemouth probably a bit better place than Southampton were back then. And there's a lot to love about Iraola. I think who in this hypothetical situation would be up there as good as any other candidate. But there's no guarantee that it's going to translate to the higher level. Like Spurs there's more pressure. There's a lot of reasons. I don't know. I just feel personally there's no reason to be deviating from where they're at the moment.
You're talking about new managers already, Tom.
I'm not. I'm saying this. I hear a lot about Iraola. People keep talking about like fans and stuff. They use him as an example. I don't know. I'm not talking about a new manager. I'm not biased. I'm very neutral, but I enjoy where Postecoglou is at, and I think there's as a neutral, I feel like he's definitely worth persevering. If I were a Spurs fan, that's what I would want to be happening.
Tom, I've got quite a few quick ones here. Richarlison, will he be a Spurs player next year, do you think?
I think they wanted to sell him last summer. I didn't think they could. They definitely would have got, if they had their money back, I probably would have taken less than that because it was a big fee. I think they like him. I just think they know I think it's fair to question whether he's physically capable of playing Ange's football. And I feel for the guy. He's been, he worked really hard. They really were so patient this time around to try and get him into a physically robust place. They talked about how lean he was, which, to be honest, I didn't realize he had any weight to lose. He always looks quite a lean guy generally, but and then he goes and gets does his hamstring, setting up that goal for Solanke. It was, your heart breaks really for him, and he's such a genuine bloke as well, even though we rarely speak to him because he doesn't really speak English. I remember actually the only time I ever spoken to him was when England played Brazil last March. I remember we lost. I think it was Endrick who scored the goal, but I was basically on Brazil duty all week, and they were based at a hotel that Arsenal used to use, not far from St Albans, and every day I was going there in the week speaking to different players, and Richarlison was up, and he did do a little bit in English, but in Portuguese he sort of opened his heart about all his issues, because obviously he's got a lot of stuff that's happened to him, which has been well documented. Very tricky time he's been going through sort of psychologically, and obviously with the injuries too. But I do think, from a club point of view, they would have sold him if they could. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's even going to be still an option next summer. I think Ange wants him. He enjoys. I think he does enjoy or appreciate his qualities. But it's hard to appreciate players' qualities when they're never available.
Is there any truth in the links to Christian Romero and Pedro Porro, Real Madrid?
I'm not sure. It's something that keeps cropping up. From as far as I can tell, Real Madrid are sort of pretty much all in on trying to get Trent at right back. And I would be kind of surprised at this stage if that doesn't happen. But I suppose if they're looking for him, then it would make sense that if they didn't get him, they would be looking around elsewhere. Obviously, Dani Carvajal is been an unbelievable player, but is getting on a little bit. So right back is an obvious area that Real Madrid need to strengthen. If they can't get Trent, then picking the Spanish starting right, or I don't know if he's regular starter now. I know he played recently, but he's obviously in the mix. Then that would make sense too. But I just think I'd be surprised if I think Trent's probably going to get to Real Madrid personally. Romero, I'm not sure.
Tom, Timo Werner, Can Ange Postecoglou improve his finishing?
I haven't really seen evidence yet. Obviously, he scored that unbelievable finish against Man City, of all teams.
Because he hit it first time. He didn't have to think about it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that sort of sums it up, really. And we've seen too many, including in that game later on. You know, the amount of times where he does have time to think about it, he can't put it away. I mean, I've been not a defender of Timo Werner. Some of the mockery, I suppose, from the Spurs fans towards him is harsh, and I know Ange doesn't like it. And there's a reason he's at the club, reason he's played all these games for Germany, and I do think, as opposed to Sonny, in terms of pace, he can stretch teams, and there are routes to victory through the sort of not chaos, but the stretching of teams that he can produce. But he just can't finish. I mean, it's been a career long, barring that sort of purple patch, which led to that move to Chelsea when he was at Leipzig. It's a career long thing, really now. And then when he first signed, I remember I didn't speak to him in the mix zone, but one of the other chaps did, and he was talking about how basically his whole the way people think of him, or at least at Tottenham, compared to how people used to think of him, or the expectations on him as a striker who scores goals, have changed. And that was even by his own admission. He's a player who doesn't think of himself in that way. He's a provider, if anything. And so in his mind, it's less relevant. But yeah, I don't see at this stage, it's quite hard to change a player's game completely, or add something in that he doesn't seem to have.
Tom, last question for you. What do you expect and what is in the January transfer window in terms of players going out the door and coming in?
I haven't thought that much about January yet, but I suppose I probably should do because we're not far away. Players going out. Trying to think of who is off the top of my head, like who's sort of ready to be moved on. I mean, there aren't.
Reguilon's got to go at some point, hasn't he?
Oh yeah, I suppose I've forgotten about Reguilon. Yeah, I mean they tried to move him on in the summer, didn't they? Just went, he got offered round pretty much to everyone. It didn't happen. He's someone that, if they can find a taker, I'm sure they'll take it. It's strange, isn't it? Because I thought he did quite well at Brentford. Man United, he wasn't even that bad either, but I presume he's on quite high wages. That has an impact. But it is strange that him not getting, to be a few players like this, aren't they? Who just sort of, not just at Spurs, but around the country now, and just sort of get left and forgotten about for a few months. But yeah, he would be the obvious one. I don't see, they talk about Richarlison. I'd be surprised, seeing a club come in and spend big money on him in January at least. And there aren't really any obvious. He's done the thing with Spurs. Like people are talking about new players, but they've kind of done most of their business now. Like it'd be adding, right? Maybe they could do with a new goalkeeper, probably as a backup, and a left back, as I mentioned before. And he's talked about wanting another centre back. I don't know how Ashley Phillips fits into this, because it seems like he's doing quite well. But like midfield, obviously Bentancur's out. It'd be interesting to see how if Gray gets used a bit during this time, because most people think of him as that's where his long-term role is, even though he actually played fullback for Leeds quite a lot before he joined Spurs. But it is kind of widely expected that he's the long-term success there. And it does seem like there's a availability there, but mainly because the two guys who are ahead of him keep shooting themselves in the foot, whether it be Basuma getting, club ban for the first game of the season. Obviously, he had loads of red cards and suspensions last season. Bentancur, right, unfortunate with some of the injuries he's picked up. And then what's happened now, they're unavailable. So it does feel like if Gray gets an opportunity, it's there for him to try and really seize. But then after that, midfield wise, maybe they might, another central midfielder. It sounds like Ange, would have quite liked someone like Conor Gallagher, but suddenly you look at Sarr, you look at Kulusevski now emerging in that role. Madison's got to come back into it, at some point. There are quite a lot of options there. I still think, personally, a wide forward is what a top class wide forward is, someone that really could improve the team. But then what does that mean for Wilson Odobert? And then you've got Mikey Moore coming through as well. So I don't think, the depth of the squad is a major issue. And I don't think, fans who are expecting sort of mass overhaul, they've kind of done that. They did that last summer, and did it the summer before. For me now, it's about adding sort of bits of real quality. But how often does that happen in January? So I don't know. I'm mainly speculating off the top of my head, really, rather than sort of like, because I haven't really looked that much at January yet. Probably should get into that to see if it feels like much is going to happen. But, you know, just looking at it objectively, I'd be surprised if there was loads and loads of business going on at Spurs this January.
Tom, some journalists I've had on before, they don't like to predict things, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Where would you predict that Spurs finish in the Premier League this season? And do you think that they will win a trophy?
So they're 10th now, right? But I don't really look much at the table at the moment because they're so concertinaed. And I know, you know, it's an easy stick to beat him with saying they're 10th. But obviously, if they'd won, they'd be 3rd. But would that even mean much at this point either? I don't know. I suppose what's slightly concerning at this point is last season, it felt like they were probably the 5th best team in the league, and maybe even sort of threw away being the 4th best team in the league, but probably by the end of it, Villa probably deserved it. This year, I'm not sure they're in the top best 5 teams in the league because other teams have sort of started to get over their mad periods, you know, like obviously Chelsea being the prime example. So that was always the worry, wasn't it? When these monsters, as Conte used to love calling them, of like Man United and Chelsea, finally sorted themselves out, then was that opportunity going to be slightly missed from Tottenham's point of view? And then Newcastle, you know, like it's not surprised they're starting to come to a bit of form because they got really good players. Pretty much they're all fit now, and they don't have any Europe, so they're going to be a concern. Then you got the types of Bournemouth, Brighton, who I don't probably expect to finish above Spurs, but have got good players, good managers, and are really competitive and don't have Europe either. So, so that's probably where fans get a bit frustrated. But I mean, and maybe think to a certain extent that the team is going backwards. But I just don't know. The competition, the level is so high, and that's why. And I think any manager coming in would face the same thing on that front. But when it's good with Ange, it feels like they can beat anyone. Like, to reiterate my initial point, where I think they'll finish, I'd probably say, I don't want to go through it in my head too much, but I'd probably say 6th, maybe. But if they finish top 4, got an amazing run, you wouldn't be shocked either. And yeah, I'm going to back him. I think if they stick with him, I think they can win the Europa League. I think they can.
Well, it's great to finish on a positive. Honestly, Tom, I could speak to you for hours. I don't know what it is about you Sun journalists. I think we do the podcast with the Sun journalists. So thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and hopefully we can get you on again very soon. Tell everyone about your YouTube channel again, Tom, and where can people find you on social media? Yeah,
YouTube is at Tom Barclay Journalist. I was told to add the word journalist in because it makes me more people can actually find me rather than random other Tom Barclays. So it's a YouTube channel that I've set up in the last few months, mainly doing reactions instantly, pretty much when I've done with my work for the paper at matches and at press conferences. Sort of, 10 to 15 minutes videos, not too long, with a bit of what. After a press conference, like what Ange said, what I think about it, looking ahead, so they'll be obviously previewing a game, so the team they'll play, any kind of news, and then post match, talking through the game, my observations, Ange's comments, because I'll be in the press conference. That's generally what I like to do. And then here and there, other sort of features. So this week I did, because obviously a bit of a break, funny enough, because I was in Greece, in Athens for the game, I did a video from literally by the Acropolis, because obviously Ange was born in Athens. I felt quite fitting. And it was kind of off the back of Ange's comments about maybe having to look at things he might have to fix in his approach. It was kind of 5 things that I think he could do with tweaking, as we've sort of referenced quite a lot throughout this video, to sort of, in my opinion, to the benefit of his team. So that would be a kind of example of a feature thing. So at Tom Barclay Journalist, and then on Twitter, I'm at Tom Barclay _. And I do have an Instagram account, but I don't really use it, so it's not really worth following. But those are the main things, and obviously reading the Sun newspaper and the website.
Well, keep up the great work. Thank you so much, Tom. And let's hope that when you get off this podcast, you are over 1,000 subscribers and your channel grows massive. Thank you so much. Thanks for watching, everyone. Thanks for listening, and we will see you on the next one. Come on, you Spurs. Bye.